Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Misconceptions. I am very thrilled to have somebody who actually I've met a few times, but honestly have heard your name for years. Welcome, Pamela Klein.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So we are going to, Pamela is a sex therapist, are you the social worker? I can't remember exactly
Yeah,
your
clinical
LCSW.
social, yes, yes, yes.
And we are going to have a conversation today about actual desire. Actually, we're talking about desire discrepancy, but we're going to see wherever this conversation goes when talking about intimacy and sexual experiences in terms of a committed monogamous relationship. And I set that as the stage because, there are many different ways to experience intimacy or sex. And this, I just want to narrow in our focus for the purpose of this conversation.
Sure,
So before we launch into the discussion, Pamela, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
sure. So yeah, I'm a social worker. I'm an LCSW. I'm a certified sex therapist, and I work with couples and women that are struggling with all different types of sexual dysfunction. I do couples therapy because they really do go hand in hand to do both, right? The marital piece and the bedroom piece really go hand in hand together. And yeah, I work with, couples and women remotely, really across, right, many different places, right, to be able to help them to be able to navigate, these types of issues.
Amazing. So we are going to set the conversation up in terms of what is desire discrepancy. Let's start with that as a definition.
Yeah. So it really means when there's like a difference, right, in the levels of desire. Let's define what desire is, because I think sometimes people even, don't really understand what that word means, right? Desire is really about like the mental anticipation, the looking forward, the thinking about it, right? So it's really more the cognitive, the look, the really anticipation of an intimate experience, right? Arousal is different, right? Arousal is the physical experience when someone is actually in the intimate experience, right? So desire discrepancy is really about one person, typically will desire more, one spouse will desire less. So when couple, everyone has a discrepancy, right? It's not like any two people in, like, say, a monogamous relationship are on the exact same level, the exact same page around desire. But what happens is that when that discrepancy gets too large, couples tend to have a hard time figuring it out. Like, how do we navigate this? You want this, I want that. I'm looking forward to this, you're looking forward right to that, and they have a hard time because really in most couples we have differences in a lot of areas, right? Like one wants to eat this, one wants to eat that. They can sort of figure it out. I think when it comes to sex and intimacy, it becomes often more charged, more vulnerable, more difficult to sort of navigate. Like, okay, how in the world do we find a way to find compromises and balances between what we each want and would look forward to?
And I think that, and I want to like kind of dispel a myth right off the bat because I think that this is one of those things that I don't know about you, but one of the most common questions I get from individuals who are talking about their sexual life and talking about their difficulties is kind of like, what's normal, right? That question
Right.
of what's
Mhm.
normal. And even within that context of the context of that question, it tends to be a question of like, if do all men want this and do all women want that? And
Mhm.
I think that, probably all of the cosmopolitan magazines, the Cosmos, the things that you sell in the grocery store
Right.
aisles, like those are the things that are going to deeply contribute to some of these assumptions that women have to fake their way into interest in sex or are not that interested or sexual, could do without it most of the
Right.
time. And men only want sex, always want sex, are that's all they think about, it's all they experience. And I'm going to add in here, and again, this is a bit of a biased perspective, and I'll name it at that. I think that when we have hypersexualized men in the religious community, hypersexualized everything female, not hypersexualized men, hypersexualized women, and everything female becomes like, sexual, like looking at a woman, seeing a woman, talking to
Yeah.
things like that, that I think that we have even exaggerated that assumption that all men think about is sex and they
Right.
can't go into a grocery store in the same aisle
Right.
as a woman without thinking
Mhm.
that he wants to jump her, right? And I'm exaggerating that comment, but it's not such an exaggeration. And I'd love your
Yeah.
perspective on
Yeah.
that. But I think we've contributed to that. And it really creates tremendous, kind of, I would say, disorientation to what is normal and
Yeah.
how do men function and how is it different than women? So maybe could we just dispel that a little bit
Yeah,
about
sure,
that? Like,
sure,
go ahead.
sure. So I try, yeah, everyone wants to know what's normal, what's everyone else, right? So I try to use the word average, right? So I think it is important. I think especially in communities where people don't, no one's talking about this, right? You're not talking to your friends or your sisters or your mothers about, their sex lives, right? So you have no idea sort of what is sort of average, right? So people are always looking to find out like, okay, what are other couples going through? Do they, right? Do they have exactly that? What's going on? Like the man's always interested and the woman's not. Is it something in between? Like there, so I think that it is important for people to understand what the average experience is like, right? So people can have some sense of like, where am I falling around that? But at the same time, there isn't really a normal, right? Because people can have many different, things going on around sex. And at the end of the day, it's really about, are they both enjoying it? Is there any distress around it? Right? Are people struggling? All of that. I think that the stereotypical, right, sort of view is that yes, men are always interested. They're always thinking about sex. Their minds are filled with this all day long. Like, yeah, they can't see a woman. They can't, sort of like just be regular around this. And women are not, right? Like they're just, just not interested, right? I think that there are many couples that will come around that will, to some degree, reflect on men being more
Sure.
interested in the women. I think that that whole hypersexualization is something that has been created, which, the average man that I see is not like that, right? And has, that self-control. But unfortunately, I think that goes back to, which we could do a whole podcast on, right? But it goes back to education from a young age, right? And the way that culturally we're, developing the, picture around this and the framework around, just sexuality and from such a young age that starts, right? In terms of like how you talk about it in your home and the taboo and all of that and how it's presented around modesty and women and sexuality and there's so much there, right? But I think really if we go back to okay, what is average, right? That at the same time there are many men that are thinking about sex, there are women that are thinking about sex, and there are many men that are struggling and there are women that are struggling, right? And that's when it comes to desire discrepancy, like we can't always assume that the lower desire spouse is the woman because very often it's not, right? And I think it's especially painful for couples that feel like they don't fit into that stereotype because like, oh, there must be something really wrong with us, right? The
Right.
fact that we're not fitting into that. What must be wrong with my husband? What's wrong with me, right? Whereas I really say it's a dynamic, right? At the end of the day, there's going to be a lower desire spouse, there's going to be a higher desire spouse. It's just the way it's going to be. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the man or the woman. And it's just something that I do think that women can struggle with desire sometimes more because the mind and the body are so connected and women for them, but just the way we're created, right? Like the mental component is a very big, factor in the way that women work, right? In terms of how their mind and their body work together. So I think that it can be more complicated for women because of that, right? Where men have minds too, and at the end of the day, it can also, but we just work differently, right? And
I think
along those lines.
Yeah, and I think you maybe what you speak to is like I remember once hearing from Tali Rosenbaum, who is one of the podcasters on Intimate Judaism, which giving a shout out to that podcast, which I think is outstanding. It talks about she's always saying like this idea that men that men also want emotional intimacy. Like, don't make this assumption
Right,
that only
right.
women want that emotional connection and men could
Yeah,
be do without
yeah,
it, but that we are wired a little bit differently. But I wonder, I think so much about like how, what I hear is this discrepancy that what the desire discrepancy might look like is the male might be like very overwhelmed at work, very struggling with financials, and the woman is feeling that and that he's disconnected from sex, and she is experiencing like exhaustion and overwhelm at home or like all the different responsibilities. And by the way, I've not spent any time with you and you've been absent because you're so worried about work. And that's where the kind of disconnection is created. And he might be able to say, I want this intimacy because it gives me relaxation. And she's like, yeah, but I don't even know who you are today. Right. I haven't spoken to you in a
right,
week. So
right.
that's where I think there might be some unique kind of challenges, male,
Yeah.
female. But let's talk a bit more about what we understand about like the desire cycle. What do we typically understand about the desire and then arousal cycle? We've definitely mentioned this before on the podcast, but it's something that I want to get into a little bit more.
Sure, sure. So desire again, sort of we conceptualize it as like the first piece, right? Like we have to be in the mood, right? That's like the term we use, right? I'm not in the mood, right? That's sort of what people refer to when they're talking about desire, right? And the what a lot of research has shown, especially research around women, right? But I think it can apply to men too, right? Is that you don't necessarily, right, need to be in the mood to get started, right? So I don't know if you ever talked about spontaneous desire versus responsive desire, right? And what that
Why don't you
means.
explain it? Something that
Sure,
doesn't mean
sure,
everybody's heard it.
sure. Yeah, I think this is a really important piece for people to understand, right? So spontaneous desire is what we refer to as what we traditionally think of as like the right way to have desire, right? That's like that just in the middle of the day or at night, your husband comes home, right? Your wife comes home, you're just like get so in the mood. You look forward, you're anticipating, you're thinking about it all day. It just like sort of hits you spontaneously, right? Like sort of out of nowhere, right? And we really hold that on a pedestal where it's like that's the way we want it to be because it feels more natural, right? It feels more natural to be in that place where it's like I want something, I'm looking forward to something, I'm anticipating something, and then I do it, right? It makes more sense to do it that way, right, in people's minds, right? But there's been a lot of research that has shown that it doesn't always work like that, right? That sometimes that desire for sex and intimacy, right, that looking forward to it can get started after a little bit of arousal starts, right? There has to be some stimuli, there has to be some starting point that will get that desire going. So that's what we refer to as responsive desire. It responds to something, right? It responds to some sort of touch. It could be even sitting down and schmoozing about something, right? And being able to just like talk out and have that emotional intimacy, which can lead to more being in the mood, right? So that is something that is just as good. It works just as well. It can lead you to the exact same outcome, right? But people sort of view it like, right, like I really would love to have spontaneous desire still. And we just understand that people are just like wired differently, and one's not right or wrong. And if you can get to the same place at the end of it, it can work as well. Then we could really start to see it as like, okay, ask yourself the question, am I open to getting there? Am I open to getting in the mood, right? Sometimes you're not open to it. Sometimes you're just too tired, or it's just too long of a day, or there's something else going on, or you just had a fight with each other, or something else going on that you're like, I'm not open to this right now, right? But a lot of times I'd be like, oh, I'm not feeling that real excitement for it, but I'm open to trying, right? And then if you get started, you can learn sort of what works for you and the right kind of things that help you to then get to a place where in that cycle, the next thing would be or like arousal, right?
So talk about what that
Sure.
means to get there, right? I want to
Yeah.
get granular because I think you
Yeah.
say, and if you get started, then you might end up there. What does
Yeah.
get started look like for the
Yeah.
women and the men that we're talking about?
Yeah. So get it started really is more around, what speaks to you to feel more connected very often, right? So if you understand, again, the door in is not always going to be something physical. It could be something emotionally based, right? But it could be also physical. Sometimes it's non-sexual touch. Sometimes it's just very light, affectionate, just sitting, and having, a cuddle next to each other, right? Sometimes it could be, like I said, just a conversation with each other. Sometimes it could be playing a game with each other and just feeling playful and connected, right? I think it's really about the connection part. What helps you to start that connection going, right? What in general helps you to feel more connected and loved and cherished and desired and all of that, right? And then can that sort of open up the window, right, to the next step, which is like, I feel a little bit of warmth happening, right? Not major arousal, right? But just a little bit of that warmth or that more looking forward to more, right? Like that desire will start to maybe a little bit creep in where it's like, oh, I'm a little open to a little bit more now, right? As opposed to sometimes we're just not in the mood in the first place for really no reason except for we're just not in the mood. And sometimes it's not about forcing it. I'll be clear about that, right? It's not about like, I'm dreading this and then you're pushing through that. It's more of like a more neutral space that you're in. Like, maybe I'm more in the mood to go read my book, right? Kind of thing, right? Than like get into bed and start because it takes energy mentally, physically to get started to be intimate, right? So sometimes it's more of like a par neutral sort of space, right? We could say, okay, we can start from there. We can try a little bit. And I really think it's important that couples communicate about that, right? You're being open about that. You're not saying, yeah, I'm totally there. You're being honest. Like, I want to try to see if I can get there and just start with a little bit of trial and error to see what works for you to get your body a little bit more in the moment and your mind and being present physically, emotionally. And that usually, again, comes back to what usually makes you feel a little more connected.
Do you feel like women sometimes have a hard time kind of expressing that without feeling that there's a risk of rejecting, right? So if a woman
Right.
says, I'm not there,
Right.
but if you can help, but I might get there eventually, like I might get there,
Yeah.
they're being interested, willing, consenting,
Yeah.
then there may be really a risk of the husband saying, okay, forget it. Like, I'm not going to push you. I'm not going to try. Like, I'm not going to
Yeah.
try if you're not interested. Like that line. I'm not going to try if you're not interested. Because I think that idea of like, well, you can help me get there doesn't necessarily feel, to me, it doesn't feel like that's sexy, right? It doesn't feel
Yeah.
attractive.
Yeah.
And so I wonder how you navigate some of that. Because yes, communication is fabulous and important and amazing. And I think Very often women are better communicators than the men in stereotyping. However, in this space, I can see where that I'm not there yet, but I'm open to getting there could
Yeah.
actually feel like rejection. Can we talk about that?
Sure, sure. That makes sense. And I think that comes back to the myth around intimacy and sexuality in general, right? Which is like, it looks like the movies where we just go into bed and it all just works and it's so beautiful and romantic and sweet and spontaneous and passionate and all just like falls into place. And real sex, right, looks like this kind of communication, right? Healthy couples, right, have to talk and have to be open. And I think when they understand it's less about, I'm not interested in you, where they understand how desire works, they understand how arousal works, they understand how the mind so much can get in the way, especially like the mental load that so many women I find carry just of general everyday life, right? Especially, right, lifestyles where they're kids and busyness and work and juggling and like, yeah, at 10 o'clock at night, right? You're not going to be so in the mood, right? And it's like, if you understand it's less, I know it's hard for couples to get there, but when they learn about this and understand that they have that psychoeducation to understand it's less about them personally, or right, like lack of interest in them versus about understanding this phenomenon in general, right? That people struggle with it. It's not something, it's a real, it takes work. It takes work to get to have a healthy, intimate relationship, right? It's not something that just comes. Then we try to take away a little bit of that piece of rejection, right? Where it's like, I'm open to working together, right? I want to work with you. I understand it's the working together that actually helps the couples get there
Mm.
versus I'm just jumping into bed and can't wait to do this. It'll be really nice and sweet to have that, right? But who has that all the time, right?
Well,
Like,
right. I think that might be something also is really speaking to the concept of long-term monogamous relationships, right?
yeah,
So what
yeah,
things look like when in the initial moments or weeks or months of a marriage could look more like that spontaneous desire.
right,
And
right,
yet looking at
right.
long-term relationships, especially with children, especially postpartum, especially after a loss or life challenges, like
100%.
the reality is that it is going to shift and change. It's going to
Yeah,
morph. And
yeah,
that then
100%.
that's where the communication piece has to be so
Yeah.
much more important.
Yeah, I see women all the time who, like every other part of their life has shifted and changed. Like you said, just going through life, right? Pregnancies, losses, life challenges, emotional stress, financial stress, just life, right? Like going through life. And they're like, yeah, everything else has changed in our lives except our sex lives. We don't really talk about, we don't really shift. We just expect it to sort of just happen. And it's just like anything else. And I think that's where people really like need help to understand, right? Like healthy couples communicate about this all the time
Mm.
and things have to shift all the time, right? And it's not something there's anything wrong with you when you need to do that. It's actually what healthy couples do, right? And regular couples have to do, and average couples have to do, right? They have to, there's before, there's during, there's after, there's in between, there's right, like there's ongoing communication around your intimate relationship, right? And if
It's so interesting because I don't think that we've been taught that. I don't think
yeah,
that there's ever
yeah,
been a discussion.
yeah,
I think
yeah,
about, we learned about sex within the context of halacha, of religious
yeah,
law, when we first got married. There was never a discussion of, and by the way, like things will change and there will be differences.
yeah,
And this is how you need
yeah,
to, these are the things you
yeah,
want to talk about after a birth and before a birth. And like, I think even just in terms of frequency, often is
yeah,
like nobody's
100%.
really talking about how to discuss what is
Right.
appropriate, necessary, valuable, etc. What's your perspective on the need for or the value of sex in a married couple's life? What I'm just curious because I
Yeah,
know, like I
yeah,
said, Tali Rosenbaum just did a great conversation around when the male is the one who is not interested, where there's
yeah,
a
yeah,
desire discrepancy there. And I thought it was incredibly well done. But just, this idea of like identifying that no, sex is, it seems from how it was presented in that podcast that there's really an obligation here, not just like you go to the mikvah and you have to have sex, but more like that sex is a critical part of a couple's life, a married couple's life, and specifically a religious couple's life. What's your perspective on that? How is that
yeah.
playing out?
Yeah, I think what I always tell people is that I find that, people think sexless marriages, right, don't work because again, the like sort of the obligatory part for a woman to a man, right? Like we have to do this. There's a need, again, stereotypically, or at what's out there, there's a need for men to have this. And unfortunately, right, a lot of women have been taught, therefore you have to do it, right? Or else, right, kind of thing. And I think that it's become unfortunately, among many, many, many couples that I see this like, again, this like chore or obligation of something we have to do, and the marriage absolutely needs it or else from that perspective. And I just take a different perspective on it, right? I think that what I find when people take sex off the table or when they're not doing it, when they're avoiding it, it doesn't work well because there is a piece of connection that healthy, good sex comes along with that you can't replace with other things. Other things are just very important too, right? Spending time and emotional intimacy are extremely, I would say, equally as important, right? But without having that added level of connection, I think there is something missing in the relationship. But not from the standpoint of because the man needs it, from the standpoint of, right, that it's something that connects a couple in a way, in a vulnerable way, in an intimate way, when it is working well, right? In a way that like you can't have that in other ways. It's not going to be as connecting then as sitting at dinner, right? When it's working well. Unfortunately, when it's not working well, it could be causing more harm than good sometimes. And that's where it gets tricky. But I think as a value of like from a place of connection, which is really what it's supposed to be about, and that they're both in it, they're both present, they're both enjoying, they're both, it doesn't be exactly equal, right? It's not always everyone's going to have it right, it's not to be exactly equal, but close to some sort of balance around that, right? Then it's a very important piece of a relationship that you can't easily just, put something else in there to be able to replace that. But when it's not working, which unfortunately a lot of people do struggle with it, then still holding up that value of like it absolutely has to happen creates a lot of problems,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? And a lot of pressure and a lot of distress, right? When a couple is sort of still holding on to that, but like when you actually ask them about the details of what's going on, it's really not working, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And it could be doing even more harm than good.
Yeah, for sure. What are the things that as a sex therapist, as a certified therapist, like what are some of the things that you are kind of thinking about when a person with a couple with desire discrepancy comes into your office? I imagine that sometimes it's kind of like, please fix the problem. Like, and I can imagine
Yeah.
sometimes when there's a referral, it's like, fix her, fix him, right?
Yeah.
Let's
So
fix it and get
it's
them.
always takes a lower desire spouse.
Yes, always.
Right.
Okay, right. Fix the
Right. It's
lower
like
desire
they're the
spouse.
one that has a problem, right? They're not interested, right? Everyone's interested in this thing. Why not? Right? Like, why wouldn't you
Mm.
be interested in something that is enjoyable, right? So there's something you're not interested in, there's something really wrong with you, right? So yeah, let's come in and fix one person here, right?
Ooh, so tell me more about it. Tell me more about
Yeah, yeah,
let's start with that. Let's tell me more about the assumption that we have to fix the lower desire spouse. Like the
yeah,
assumption is that this is great, this is awesome, everybody wants this, right? That is the assumption.
right.
And then and then when there's a problem, it's you have to fix the person that doesn't align with that kind of
Yeah,
cultural norm or expectation. But it
yeah.
sounds to me like you're saying to me that actually that might not be the appropriate approach.
I really view it as a couples issue, right? That there's a dynamic that's going on, and almost always when you go into it, there is a dynamic that's going on, right? There's always, almost always, I want to say, right? Like there's three parts to it. There could be something going on for that lower desire spouse, right? That needs to be worked on someplace that she or he might be stuck or blocked in some way that they're struggling with, right? It could be the higher desire spouse is also blocked in some way. Something's going on for them individually, could be, right? And there's always a dynamic going on between the two of them, right? Whether it's pressure, it's rejection, it's coming from both sides, a lot of emotions, a lot of intensity, right? Like, and usually couples are not coming in usually so early on. So then there's sometimes years, right, of this going on, and there's a lot of hurt and
Damage.
pain and
Yeah.
damage and undoing and all of that, right? So I really view it as like it's a couples issue. It's not like, okay, if you just became more interested, I wouldn't be putting any pressure on you, right? The higher desire spouse might say, right? Like if you just sort of had normal interest in this. But the
Hmm.
question is always, what is going on, right? What is going on, right? If a person, I don't even look at it so much as unless there's like extremes, right, in terms of going on, in terms of low desire, meaning something along the lines of like real aversion, complete avoidance, right? Like really extreme negative, dreading it, kind of, something going on there, or on the higher spectrum, right, where someone's like compulsively interested, right, or they're compulsively looking for it, or they're in a place where they're asking for things in frequency or intensity that are not within the average realm, which again, I find most time is not the case. It's usually people are falling somewhere in sort of the averages, but there's a discrepancy, right? So it's more like we need to work on both sides, right? To be able to tweak both sides and really get to what are the various components going on here. Like I really look at it as like a pie chart of things, right? There's like usually multi-layered pieces going on. And often that dynamic is the first piece that needs to be worked on because very often what's happening is that there's pressure, right? Which is understandable. Somebody wants something that they're not getting. It starts to create pressure, right? It might have started with the lower desire spouse, it might have started with the higher desire spouse. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day, right? Like it's not about who started the fight kind of thing. It's like you're both struggling, right?
Hmm.
And very often we have to turn around the dynamics to create really an environment where there really is often less pressure and there really is space to work on it because pressure is really the biggest killer of all of this, right? So
Right.
people are coming in saying like, fix the lower desire spouse, make he or she more interested, right? When there's really a big sort of issue going on, which is there's a ton of pressure going on here, right? And we can't even, and I tell people this, we can't even start to work on whatever is blocking that person from having more desire until like that pressure cooker is like, taken away, right?
Mhm.
And we even have space and energy to be able to put towards working on it, right?
I'm wondering with the higher desire spouse, I'm wondering if you, as a therapist, like what is that line of this is normal, this is this is high
Yeah,
desire, right? Like
yeah,
how do you
yeah.
define that of like this is within average realm versus this is considered high desire and a bit much, right?
So,
Obviously, I think
yeah.
intensity of pressure is going to be a part of it, but also, I mean, I think so much of it comes down to frequency, does it not?
Yeah, I think well, I think the terms, right, are really just relative to one or the other. Meaning, I think it's not about your high desire because you're not normal, right, or you're not average. It's you're much higher than she is, right, kind of thing, right? So we sort of look at it more like there's a low desire. Everyone has a low desire and a high desire spouse. That's what I was saying, right? I think
Mm,
it's where it's more than just sort of a discrepancy and someone's falling into the extremes, then we might call it something else, right? It could be compulsive behavior, there could be addiction. On the low desire piece, it could be aversion, there could be, right, some sort of trauma. Like, it could be many different reasons for why people are going to the more extreme levels. Everyone's going to have a high desire and low desire. And I think it's not about the line that it's crossing. I think it's really more about how large the discrepancy. That's where people are really coming in more distressed, right? It's like we are having a very big difference between, right, each other, right? So it's less about are you within the normal range or not? It's really more about what are you each experiencing, right? That is creating that discrepancy between the two
hmm
of you, right? So that does also
Yeah,
count the frequency, right? Like I want it much more, right? I want it much less, right? And then
right,
what's the compromise around that? Like find the average? Like that doesn't make any sense, right? It's like,
right, right.
right? So it often does come to frequency. I think it comes to sometimes what they're doing. Sometimes it comes to, right, like, how engaged they each are. I want her to initiate more, him to initiate more, him to be more dominant, her to be like, right, there's like a lot of different areas where it can come up in, but often frequency is the most likely, right, thing that's going to come
hmm
up around like, I want it to happen more often. She wants it to happen less often, assuming it's
hmm
that, right?
Right. And so what's your approach? Like what's the fix when you talk about like what it means to work in therapy through these desire discrepancies? Obviously, I think you're beginning from a couple's perspective, right?
Right,
It can't
right,
be fix this
exactly.
spouse, fix that spouse.
Right.
So what's your approach? What's your mindset as a
Yeah.
therapist?
So again, my mind is always it's a couples issue, right? So that no, it's not about just send in the Lord's desire spouse and then send them back kind of thing. And people often do start that way. And if they do start that way, I always encourage them to come in as a couple, right?
Sure.
And then I try to really piece out again, right, the individual parts of it and the dynamic parts of it. If there are individual pieces that again feel more extreme or more stuck, sometimes people have to go for individual therapy, right, to be able to address that, right? But from a couple's standpoint, the approach is really, really first working on the dynamic, right? And the way that I explain this to people, right? And maybe it doesn't even sound so fair, but it's really the only way that it works is like if you are going, I don't know if you ever talked about brakes and accelerators.
No, go ahead. Feel
Okay, so,
free.
so this is how I explain it, right? That they're, arousal and desire and all pieces around intimacy really work what I refer to as like there's a brake and there's an accelerator in all of us, right? And if anyone drives a car, they know when you're starting to drive a car, right? If you basically want to accelerate your car, right? But your foot is on the brake and you press the accelerator, it won't go very far. It may even break your car, right? But like your car will not go if your foot is on the brake, right? And very often what happens is that lower desire spouses have their foot on the brake for some reason. We need to identify what those reasons might be, but their foot is on the brake, right? What happens a lot of times, and even maybe some non-sex therapists will try to do this, is they'll try to add a lot of accelerators in, right? But we know when you press on the accelerator and your foot's on the brake, it doesn't go anywhere, right? It even may damage things, right? So they'll try to add in, try to put on lingerie, try to, set a night for yourself where you can do something, put on perfume, take a bubble bath. They try all these different sort of, accelerators, right? Where it's like, go out for a romantic dinner and then come home. And most of the time, couples find it moves it just an inch or so, right? Because it's not really addressing, again, the dynamic part. It's just addressing, like, let's just try to accelerate this.
Mm,
So, from my experience, that really never works, right? From my experience, I more first start with why is your foot on the brake, right? It's not about fixing the lower desire spouse because very often it's about, okay, I feel a lot that I have to get there. I feel like, right, that there's something like it's a need, right? It's a need for me to, accomplish this task tonight, right? Because again, the relationship needs it, right? And if I don't do it, then I'm a bad wife, I'm not good enough, I'm holding back. I mean, many different things that they believe in, right?
My husband might cheat,
Right,
right?
right, or look at pornography, or right, like meaning, and sometimes I've even been told these things, right? That
Uh,
like,
Absolutely. Right,
right,
for sure.
right. So it's like they're in a place where it's like it's very goal oriented. It's very much a have to do this, right? And that is not necessarily even coming from the husband, to be honest, right? Like it's often coming either culturally or it's coming because the woman feels so much guilt around it, right? Assuming she's a lower desire spouse and she feels so much guilt and she just has to do this. And that's a huge reason. I feel like it's number one factor that someone's foot is on the brake, right? If you have to do something like this and you feel like you have to, even if you know that like your husband again is not saying you have to, but you feel like you have to, it kills all desire, all arousal, all interest in this, right?
Mhm.
So most of the time, I would say that's the most common reason, or one of the biggest reasons that a woman's foot is on the, or the lower desire spouse's foot is on the brake, right? And it's something that's like, that's a stopping point. So we usually start with that, right? Usually try to relieve the pressure, relieve the need in the sense of like this absolute need. And if it doesn't happen, right, the world will sort of come to an end kind of feeling, right? And we try to create an environment where it's a little bit lighter, it's a little bit easier. We talk about it, we open up communication about it. They can navigate together. They can feel like they're on a team together versus like, either one of them are the dragon that they have to slay, right? It's like, no, you're a team together. You want to work together. And almost always they're both right there, right? Like, yeah, we want this to get better for both of us, right?
Mhm.
I'm not saying it's the only thing that's obviously hitting on a break. There could be many different things. There could be small things like our baby is in the room, right? And like, I'm feeling like overwhelmed by, they may wake up, right? That's like an easier fix, you want to say, right? Sometimes it's, yeah, I'm going through my own emotional, right? Situation at work, my own personal life, and I feel like I talk about losses, right? So many different things we're going through, right? And like, I'm just not up yet for having sex, right? Like, there could be so many different reasons, but if we identify and sort of figure out why is your foot on the brake, how do we help it to gently come off of it slowly, not in a pressurized way, then we could talk about accelerating, right? Then we could talk about adding things in. Then we could talk about, maybe they need some help to figure out, right? Like what's the next step in that? But
Mhm.
almost always, once that foot comes off, things accelerate almost on their own, right? So it's my
Mhm.
approach is really like that. It's about taking it, sort of minimizing the things that are not working, maximizing the things that are working, and create an environment which feels less pressurizing, more open, more of an ability to communicate and be a team. And then things start to move, like almost miraculously, you want to say, right? Where it's
Right,
like,
right.
once that environment, happens, it's like, oh, this is what we needed, right?
Hmm. Hmm. What about, one of the things I think about when it talks about like what are one of the deepest contributors to putting the foot on the brake or having the foot on the brake or feeling like there's so much restriction is I think mental health related issues, right? Like that's definitely what I see and where we're dealing with things like, I'm struggling with depression or I'm struggling with anxiety or I'm struggling with like I'm not well and I'm really, really,
Yeah,
I'm doing what I can. Maybe I'm getting the help that I need, hopefully, but I'm dealing with this postpartum OCD. What fill in the
mhm,
blank, right? Fill
yeah,
in the difficulty.
yeah, yeah,
And then there's this added responsibility, added thing where in theory might feel good, but very few things feel good for me right now.
yeah,
And I'm wondering how we manage these kind of things where there's a little bit of a longer term trajectory.
yeah,
It isn't something that I can help alleviate some of the pressure, some of that kind of constructed pressure. There's real
right,
impact on function. There's really
yeah,
a significant impact on how I relate to the world around me, how I relate to myself, my body. Um, in the aftermath of things like losses and depression, there could be feelings of my body failed me. Like I'm having a hard time even experiencing pleasure at a
yeah,
time when my
yeah,
body
for
is
sure.
this place of death, things like that, right?
Yeah,
So where
yeah,
seems like a lot more in the future than just
yeah,
working out the breaks, right?
yeah.
What's your approach when we're dealing with things that are so much more kind of pulled.
Pervasive. Yeah,
Yeah, much more
yeah,
pervasive.
yeah, yeah.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah, for sure. So it is harder, obviously, to be able to navigate it. I think that's where a couple navigating that together is super important, right? That like again, assuming it's a woman going through something, especially obviously all the hormonal parts of our lives, right? And then different, periods of time where you could be having that more than others, right? That like I very much encourage then the husbands to come in, that he has a place also to be able to get that support, right? I think that sometimes people take the approach of like again, like taking sex off the table in those situations. I really reserve that for real crisis situations, right? Because I find again, sometimes it does more harm than good to just like totally shove this part of your life. It's not a reality, right? To be able to like
Mm,
totally put this part of your life aside. I think what's really important then in those situations is I think that that whole piece of like we just have to keep going with the program, right? No matter what, right? That has to be dispelled, right? That has to be
mhm,
like no, right? Like everything else in your life has paused, right? Like has been affected by this. This will also be affected by this, right? And we deal with the grief and the feelings of sadness and the disappointment and the difficulty that come along with that, really on both of their parts, right? Like she wouldn't want the loss of that either, right? But she may be thinking about that less, given that she's just dealing with so much, right? And he may
mhm,
be feeling that more. But I think again, generally I find when the husbands are in there and they understand, right, that like this is part and parcel of what their wife is going through, right? It's also going to severely impact intimacy,
mhm,
right? Like even
mhm.
like pregnancy, which is a lighter thing we're talking about, right? Like people often think like program as scheduled, right? Like just like we're just going to continue on. And it's like no one just gets pregnant and it doesn't affect their sex life, right? Like it's
Mhm.
not possible, right? And when couples really, I think it goes back to the education and the understanding of like that's what the average couple is experiencing. When the average person is going through postpartum, right, depression, they are not interested in sex, right? They're gonna have a really hard time having sex, right? And that couple has to navigate that together. And they have to be on the
Absolutely.
same page together to get to a place where it's like, at the end of the day, we're not just throwing anything out the window, but we're trying to work together in this current reality,
Yeah,
right? Like often couples come to me and they're like, it can't be this way. I'm like, but it is this way, right? And we have to work with that. And we have to acknowledge all the emotions and feelings that come around with that and all the parts of ourselves that have a hard time with that, right? But
totally.
once we put that all out there, usually it feels more manageable as opposed to just continue what you're doing, even though there's this huge other thing going on in your life, right?
Right.
And when a
Right.
couple's like feeling like, okay, we can work together to find a way to still make this be part of our life, and maybe it may be minimized a whole lot, it may look a whole lot different. We have to understand if there will be triggers, there will be places that would be too hard to go to. Sometimes certain pieces of it are, let's say, taken off the table. Like, let's say if a woman is really, really struggling, right? And she needs to minimize the frequency, or she needs to, she's not comfortable kissing right now because that really triggers her. So, yeah, that might get taken off the table. That might be something they understand as we need to pause this right now because it's too much, right? Just as an example, right?
Mhm.
Or there may be certain things, let's say pain comes up, right? Somewhat often postpartum, right? Like, how do we work with that, right? Like, yeah, certain parts of it may have to get minimized. And we try to work together with that to recognize that they're both people, right? And they both will have feelings and desires and interests and all of that going on. Their desires may not align right now, given different, experiences they're having right now emotionally. But that if they feel, I think it's about getting them to be a team together, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Like you're fighting this in every other way. You can fight this too here as a team and be able to recognize like you both are important, but you may need to totally revamp this right now, given what's going on,
And I
right?
keep hearing you say for now, for now, for now, right? Like,
Exactly.
because you're not gonna, you're not going to be nauseous through the entire, you're not going to
Right.
be nauseous beyond, hopefully beyond the pregnancy, and you're not
Right.
going to have like that smell aversion throughout the entire, through, you
Right.
may
Right.
have it
Even
through the whole
postpartum,
pregnancy.
hopefully that will get
Absolutely. Hopefully
improved,
it'll
right?
get
That will
better.
improve, right? Exactly. Right. Meaning,
Exactly.
I think that what happens a lot of times I find is that people get stuck in the down, right? They attach
Yeah.
a lot of meaning to it. They're like, oh my gosh, what is going on here, right? The fact that, you lost your orgasms, let's say after having a baby, right? Like,
Mhm.
and I once had a couple come in, right? And I actually sent them away. I said, whatever you're going through is totally average, right? People have different types of orgasms after having a baby, right? And that's okay. Or she couldn't have an orgasm at all, right? And it was just like, can you just sort of ride this wave, right? And recognize that most likely, we don't guarantees, but most likely this will pass. It's just a time period thing. And I think when people understand that, like, there's tons of up and downs in the intimate relationship, just like there are in life, right? And when you get to a down, right? Assuming it's not crashing down, right? Most of
Sure.
the time it's not, right? And then they're like, okay, right, let's just sort of ride this wave. And sometimes the waves are longer than others, right? And sometimes the waves are harder than others. But when you sort of view it that way, and it's not, you don't attach so much meaning to it, or sex doesn't have a specific script attached to it. Like it has to look like this or like that in order for us to say we're having a good sex life, right? And you
Excellent.
right, shift along with the different shifts that happen in life, then things just go so much better. I mean, think about aging, right? Like how many changes come along with that, right? And like how you have to adapt to that in your sex life. And it doesn't mean you can't have sex, doesn't mean you can't enjoy sex, right? But it may look totally different, right? Just given all the medical and biological changes that go on. Right? And we can
That's
sort
right.
of see it as like, can we just work together and navigate and be open enough to say that that is going to happen naturally, that's going to happen as shifts, then we're so much more prepared when they come, right? As
Absolutely.
opposed to like, oh my gosh, what does this mean? Oh my gosh, we're in a crisis, right? Like things are so
Right.
bad,
And
right?
I think when you keep saying, and what does this mean? Right. I think so much of this is like when we are addressing it, when we're aware of that there's a component of this that's expected, anticipated, going to happen, then we might be able to pull away from that line of, well, what does this mean about us? What does this mean
Yeah,
about our marriage? What does this mean about our relationship? Right.
yeah,
Versus seeing like, okay, so this has showed up here. We knew shown up. We know this was possible. Maybe if we were lucky, we had a discussion about it, but probably not. But like, okay, maybe we can even get advice and guidance so that it's not so terrifying. And it
yeah,
doesn't have to mean we're in a really bad space or we're
right.
really falling apart or our marriage is in decline or anything that
Yeah,
goes along with that. I do think that we have to address two components. One, I want to talk about mikvah. I want to just talk about the ebb and flow of the natural ebb and flow when there is a religious life, when there is nothing preventing a period,
right.
that there is that on and off again, which I think can, on one hand is always sold as like the most amazing thing. And it's so, healthy and amazing and protective of relationships. And also when there's desire discrepancy, what you're kind of saying is like, you have 2 weeks to figure it out. And if after 2 weeks, screw, sucks for you, move on. You got 2 more weeks in a couple weeks time, right? Like there's really this, the ability to be like, okay, if not now, then tomorrow
Yeah,
is really limited when you're using the on and off again cycle of mikvah. So that's one thing I want to talk about. The second thing I want to talk about is very often women today I'm talking about like, kind of women that are not actively attempting to get pregnant or breastfeeding are very often on continuous birth control. So it could be the IUD, it could be a birth control where they're taking, several months worth of pills or more, and
yeah.
they're not getting a period. And so this is one of those spaces I think where you kind of have this like, well, if not now, tomorrow might become tomorrow, 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 or tomorrow,
Right.
especially when there's differences in desire. So can we start with mikvah and then go
Sure.
to a little bit
Sure.
into like what kind of I think is a cultural reality, right?
Right.
I think it's actually kind of interesting. And I've been talking about this a little bit more. I had this like moment of awareness that I don't know if in the non-religious world we have so many women on continuous birth control because once you hit 40s and you're finished having your kids, maybe even younger, you're having a vasectomy or you're having a tubal ligation. So there's no risk of pregnancy. So you
Yeah.
probably are not on birth control.
Right.
So you are cycling regularly.
Yeah.
You have this on again, off again cycle with or without mikvah. We're talking secularly, right? But I don't think that outside of the religious world, women have just stopped their periods permanently for
Yeah.
years on end, which just makes me wonder like this kind of cultural reality makes me kind of like, who's doing a study? I don't know on what, but who's doing a study? So
Sure. Maybe,
let's
maybe
start
we'll
off.
have to do it.
We'll have to
Okay.
do the study. So talk to me about, I don't even know about what, but like I
Right,
think things are
right.
different
Yeah.
for women who
And
are
I
not
think the two
cycling.
things are connected because I
Of
think
course
definitely
they
people
are,
are actually skipping their periods because they're avoiding going to the mikveh, right? Just a mikveh experience. Sometimes women are like,
for
I just want
sure.
to avoid that at all costs, right? Like, so I'll just stay on birth control or I'll get IUD that never get my period, right? Like the Mirena and all of that, right? Like, so I think very often they are connected. Yeah, I do think there is the natural ebb and flow. Definitely having a break is important, right? I do think having that break to really work on emotional intimacy. It's not about just a break and like, goodbye, see you later, right? For 2 weeks, right? I actually really encourage couples, like, I tell couples, as often as you have sex, is as often as you should be spending time when she's Anita, right? Like, doesn't have to be going on a major date, but just at home, right? For that half hour, sit and have a cup of coffee together, play a game, whatever you want to do, right? But like make sure you prioritize that emotional intimacy part too, because it's huge, right? Like that people are not giving enough attention to that, right? And that's also something that takes work and time and energy and all of that. And I don't encourage people to even necessarily go out of the house, right? That's complicated for a lot of people. Just spend time in the house together, right? Just, but set aside time for it. Just like you prioritize sex, you prioritize time, right? So I think that people are allowed, I think it's important to have that break, but I think it also comes along with a lot of pressure, the whole mikveh, right, piece, right? A lot of that pressure comes along with that because yes, there's 2 weeks. It's very like, okay, we only have a certain amount of time. Mikveh night itself, I think, creates a tremendous amount of pressure, which I try to help
Sure.
couples take a step back from and just recognize like it's not the be all and end all of everything, right? And I think especially women are not communicating enough what they need those nights, right? Like I really try to work with couples, say like, what do you need, right? Just on a practical level. If you have to go to a wedding and you just needed help to get out, what do you need, right? Do you need help with bedtime? Do you need to serve on paper plates? Do you need to just buy out dinner? Whatever, right? Like, think, what do you need earlier in the day? What do you need, right? Like, try to be realistic about the fact that there is a lot that comes along with that night, right?
Totally.
And that if you're already struggling with desire, right, and then you're exhausted by the end of the night of just having gone out and spent a lot of time and energy, sometimes people get very stuck from an anxiety perspective on it, right? Like just recognize that it's something you need to have a lot of self-care around and care as a couple, right? So I have a lot of women who like they'll tell their husbands, I need you home a little earlier. I need to feel like, great, you do this and that. We're a tag team. We can work together. So that when you come home, especially when the time is later to come home, right? It's like you're not completely wiped out, right? And if you are, it's okay, right? Like you can work with that too, right? And just recognize that and talk about it. And like, I think when a couple talks about it ahead of time and says, like, this is where we're at, and every month it might be a little different, right? Again, from so many different factors desire is affected by that, like, just be honest and real. And the more you do that, the less of that rejection that comes along with that. And it's just like, when that higher desire spouse realizes, okay, like it's not as personal that he or she is not coming at the end of mikvah night and like being like so excited to do this. It's like it's also part of life. Like as life goes on, right? There's just more on your plates, more on your mental loads, more on your physical load. It's not going to be as exciting, right? And that's okay. You can try to still make it. I also don't think you have to go to the other extreme, which is like ignore the night. But I always encourage couples like I've had couples that will like, make sure they go for a walk when, she comes home, or they'll go out for ice cream, or they'll just spend time on the couch, right? And like making it less about this goal-oriented, we have to get somewhere approach, which I think as people go on in life, they realize it's less about that. Versus like, can we just have moments of connection, given that we did have a break and you're coming back, right? But it's less about we have to get here or there, we have to have
Hmm.
intercourse, right, kind of thing, right? Like it's less about that versus can we just try to have some level of a physical connection that may even not be so sexual,
Right.
right?
And I just have to put like a pin in this conversation to acknowledge that many women are taught, men and women are taught that there's a
Yeah,
formal halachic religious law obligation that
yeah,
on mikvah night you must. And
yeah,
I think that I have relearned that. Like I've been
yeah,
taught
yeah,
now,
yeah,
like actually not really. It's more like, yeah, you should. And this is the goal. This is a goal, but
right,
also real life and also communication and also like
yeah,
pull the pressure off, especially if that night is not going to
right,
work. And
yeah,
I think women and men need to really be able to hear that and be like, wait, what I learned when I was 19, 20, 21 isn't really working right now. Do I need to
right,
relearn? Do I need to re-ask? And I
yeah,
want to just encourage listeners that if this is a space of difficulty, then you need to re-ask. And one other thing
yeah,
I just have to mention, I have a friend who would say to me, every time she went home from the mikveh, this was many, many years ago, and she would say, I'd go to Walgreens and I'd buy a lipstick. And I'd walk up and down the aisles and I'd just look at all the products and all the self-care stuff. And then I'd buy myself a new lipstick. And then I went home. And she's like,
mm,
I'd spend at least 30 minutes in Walgreens just checking out the
right,
new products in order to decompress from mikveh, in order to
yeah,
be more in my
yeah,
body, in order to be emotionally ready. Because she knew that she had an excited husband waiting for her. And
right,
she also knew that she needed to go and decompress from the day. And she did
yeah,
it in Walgreens. And her
mhm,
husband knew about it and was
right,
incredibly supportive, right? It was a discussion. It wasn't like, when are you coming home? When are you coming home? It was
right,
like, go to
right,
Walgreens, take as much
yeah,
time as you
for
need, and come
sure,
back with a new
for sure,
lipstick,
for
right?
sure,
Like,
for sure,
so let's move this just because of time. Let's talk now about the women who have no break and are
right,
on continuous birth control for all the reasons like why would I want to get a period? But let's say, going into continuous birth control cycles where there is no cycle. It's
mhm, mhm,
always available.
yeah,
How do you
yeah.
work with that desire discrepancy when there's no structure?
Yeah, so we try to create a little more structure, right? Sometimes scheduling, which is people think it's like a dirty word for sex, right? But it's actually a very helpful word, right? Scheduling doesn't have to mean at 9:35 on Tuesday nights, right? It can mean, again, we talk about it, we try to look at our week, we try to plan a little bit. I think that for so many couples, when they actually try it out, they see how much helpful it is, especially when they have those long cycles, right? Where it's like there's no break in sight, right? So they sort of try to say, okay, let's try to work towards this is once a week, once on the weekend type of a thing. Sometimes it's we're going to talk about it, we're going to look ahead, we're going to try. It's never set in stone. It's like let's try to be open that night to trying to get there kind of a feeling, right? And I think for
Mm-hmm.
again, people have very busy lives and no breaks and all those kinds of things. It actually works really well for when they try it out. So I encourage people to try it, right? Just explore and see if, out of curiosity if it could work for you, right? But I think, yeah, creating some sort of structure, because I always say the worst part is to get into bed and be like, right? Like you're both in a place where you're like trying to read each other's minds, right? Every single night, right? And it's like an opportunity every single night, and it's an option to always do it. That is like the worst mind game you could be in, right? And for both, really, for both the higher and the lower desire spouse, right? Like if you can be more straight about it and open about it and be like, right, like how are you doing? And are you feeling up for tonight? Are you not? Do you just want to cuddle? And people can expectations is so important, right? And around this because I think when you set out the proper expectations and everyone's on the same page, right? When it's
Sure.
like, maybe we can try to get there. And that's, a lot of women complain about that to me. It's like, I can never just cuddle. I'm like, then just say all you want to do tonight is be very clear. You just want to cuddle. And I promise you, your husband will be okay with that, right?
And even if he expresses arousal, even if there
It's
is an
normal.
erection
Right,
or arousal,
right,
just say like, yeah, that's part of cuddling.
right.
And also that doesn't mean that you are now obligated into
Right,
sex.
exactly,
Yeah,
right. And but I think that when the husbands know, like you're not interested in sex tonight, you just want to cuddle, they're so much calmer. Also, it's like, okay,
sure.
fine, it's yeah, normal to get aroused, all that to want it, right?
Sure.
But it's like you're on the same page, right? So there has to be when there are those longer breaks, for sure there has to be much more communication in a certain way, right? Because it's like it's an ongoing, endless sort of right, non-structured, right, sort of open-ended piece. And it's like
Sure.
we need to be able to really titrate that a bit and be able to a place where it's like, okay, this is not just forever on the table, right? And then
Absolutely.
it works so much better when they're able to do that.
I hear it. Okay, as we close today, what are some misconceptions about sex or about desire that you'd like to make sure our audience understands?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest things, right, that it the misconception is that it doesn't take work, right? It does take work. It takes, like as you see, it takes a lot of that openness and communication and being able to really recognize that like it's going to take energy. It's not something that you will just fall into, not something that you will just happen spontaneously all the time. There's nothing wrong with your relationship. If anything, it's a healthy relationship, right? When they're able to do that and they're able to work at it together and it's not something that just will be effortless, right? Like that's, I think, really important. I think also desire is something that just again sort of doesn't just always come naturally, right? Especially as the life cycle goes on and women change and hormones and all these different things, right? It's something that you have to put a certain amount, right, of thought into and thinking about and trying to think about, okay, what's pressing on my brake? What could help accelerate, right? Also the idea of like it just doesn't naturally just come about throughout your day, throughout your life, right? It's something that's not really there. And I think really that, it's something that again, healthy couples, normal couples have a desire discrepancy, right? Like that's not the issue. The fact that you have a discrepancy is not a problem, right? That's going to be the case. We have differences in so many areas of life, right? It's about how are we navigating it together. It's about how are we, viewing each other. Are we viewing each other as the enemy? Are we viewing each other as the friends that we can work together with this? And when you're viewing it as like a work together, it works, right? Like it actually can really blossom and work and grow and be a wonderful thing together, right? It's really just about adjusting those expectations.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Pamela, this was a great conversation. This is going to be a
Yes.
winner. I know that. Thank you so much for the
Thank
opportunity
you
to
for
talk
having me.
together.